Here is a periodic reminder, and it's useful to do it with just under 3 weeks to go until Election Day, why it's just as likely conservatives will lose the Supreme Court under a President Trump. This is an outstanding diary post at Red State from somebody named Kentanucci04 that just lays it out. I mean, all ducks in a row, makes perfect sense. It's devastating. Trump supporters, especially you cuck-servatives like Doug Gibbs, Alex Ferguson, etc., listen carefully and come to grips with reality. Now, over and over again, we've heard both we've heard both Trumplicans and cuck-servatives alike try to shame and or scare us true conservatives, i.e. never Trump and never Hillary, none of the above, into backing Trump by claiming that if we don't vote for him, Hillary will pack the court with liberals and it'll be lost for generations. I've also been told many times that Trump can be trusted to appoint conservatives, thus saving the court. Notice they never substantiate that claim. They never say, well, why can he be trusted? What in his background persuades you that he can be trusted? How has that trust been earned? What merits it? They just say, but Hillary! While it's true that Hillary will nominate liberal justices, the claim that Trump would fight against Democrats in Congress to nominate conservative justices flies in the face of everything we know about Trump from his entire life history. First of all, he's a liar. He's full of shit. He doesn't keep his word on anything. Just ask the banks who he refused to pay back loans to when his businesses went bankrupt, or the workers at those same businesses whom he refused to pay overtime to, or in some cases refused to pay at all. His word isn't worth the paper on which it's written, and that's literally all we have when it comes to his promise about appointing good judges. Secondly, he has not fought for a single conservative principle, policy, or person ever in his entire worthless, misbegotten, worm-eaten, egg-sucking life. And he isn't about to start at age 70. That's just not how the brain works, folks. By the time you're 70 years old, you know who you are. And you're old enough to not care what anybody else thinks. And Donald Trump has never cared about what anybody else thought because he's never had to. Man, I would have loved to see Trump endure the 3.5, 4 months of constant daily abuse at my former job that I had to in order to maximize as much money as I could for my family. He's never had to do anything like that. I mean, by the time you're 70 years old, you know who you are, and everybody else does too. Hint, hint. Either you've been humbled and changed into a better person by your life experiences, or you haven't. Trump is the latter. Clearly, the latter is true with Trump because he's never experienced tragedy or intense suffering or any kind of suffering in his entire worthless, misbegotten, worm-eaten, egg-sucking life. That's not an exaggeration either. Just read his biographies if you don't believe me. He's been a liberal his entire life, a New York liberal Democrat. And in fact, he still is. He's just pretending to be a conservative to win the votes he needed in this election, which is really the primary votes in order to get the nomination, because that's really all he was interested in. He only cares about himself, not ideas and policies that conservatives have fought for decades. He certainly doesn't care about the Constitution, Doug. Which tells me he would actually appoint a judge who was not an originalist, because only that kind of judge would be willing to allow him to pass his executive orders or issue them. He wants to rule by decree. Remember, he's a strong man, dictator, authoritarian. Benito Mussolini with hair. A true originalist justice in the mold of Thomas or Alito would vote to strike down and block his executive overreach. And do you really think Trump's ego could handle that? Do you think he would tolerate that? Think about it, conservatives. Think about it, Doug. If Trump has the power to nominate a judge who will act as a rubber stamp for his big government, isolationist, national socialist, protectionist agenda, why wouldn't he? Why would he do anything else? It's simply illogical to suggest that he would use up what little political capital he would have to fight his Democrat friends and allies over a conservative justice who would be likely to end up opposing his pet projects anyway. He'd be much more likely to cut a deal with his Democrat friends. Now, wouldn't he? But this is assuming that Trump would have the chance to nominate those justices in the first place, which requires a second assumption that the three liberal justices, who are the oldest members of the court, will die or retire in the next 4 years. Trumplican's entire argument hinges on this core premise, because without it, it falls apart like a house of cards. So let's examine it, shall we? When Hillary Clinton is elected president, there is a chance that no Supreme Court justices will die or retire, which means she would only replace Scalia with a liberal, and when she loses in 2020, if she lives that long, it would be far more likely the conservative, well, that's a bit of a stretch, but who knows. But let's be optimistic just for the hell of it. It would be far more likely that the conservative president who took her place would have a chance to replace the justices who would retire at some point during his or her presidency. On the other hand, if by some miracle Trump won, he would surely lose in 2020 if he even served out his term, since he would be the worst president in American history, bar none, not even close. I say this without a shadow of doubt in my mind. That would mean that he would replace Scalia, assuming he would replace Scalia with Mary Ann Trump Berry, his partial birth abortion zealot sister. But let's just indulge you people, you Trump supporters, and say that he replaced Scalia with a conservative justice, and the next liberal president in 2020, Julian Castro, more than likely, would replace the justices who retired during his presidency, thus tipping the court totally, irretrievably to the left. In other words, it's a numbers game, and it's a numbers game that extends beyond one presidential election cycle, one presidential term. Do you try to, it's not even this is where it falls down as an intellectual exercise, because Hillary's going to win. Trump can't win. But which would be better? Of the two scenarios, in the big picture, which would be better? Hillary serves one term and only replaces Scalia, and then, I don't know, Scott Walker, Bobby Jindal, who knows, whatever, Marco Rubio, whoever it happened to be, would then get to replace Ginsburg, get to replace Kennedy, get to replace Breyer. I mean, by 2024, under that scenario, you may be looking at, let's see, 4 and then 3. You could be looking at a 7-2 conservative majority, or originalist, constitutional originalist majority in the Supreme Court in 8 years. 8 years from now, that's what you could be looking at, potentially. 7-2 conservative. We go down to 4 or 5, but then we get the next 3, so I go from 4, we go to 5, 6, and 7. Whereas if Trump were to win, and even if you assume that he did replace Scalia with a conservative, he'd get destroyed. He wouldn't even serve out his term. And then we would potentially be down, or at least we would still be razor thin, either 4-5 or 5-4. That's why you have to look at the big picture. You have to look beyond just one term, one presidential election cycle. The fact that we're talking about nearly equal probabilities here severely weakens Trumplican's Supreme Court argument. Because there is at least as much of a chance that if Trump is elected president, or were elected president, the very thing that Trumplicans claim to fear, a swing of the court's balance to the left, would happen as if Hillary is, well, she's going to be elected president. And consider this, as I made a brief allusion to earlier, mere moments ago. The 3 oldest justices are, again, Ginsburg, currently 83, same age as my father, as a matter of fact, Kennedy, 80, and Breyer, 78. They are all liberals. If Trump was elected president, why would they retire knowing that that would make it possible for him to replace them with a conservative? Not that he would, but we're talking hypothetically here. Why wouldn't they just wait 4 more years until he gets destroyed or doesn't even serve out his term and a Democrat is elected and can replace them with liberals? These justices have clearly demonstrated in the past that they're willing to act in a partisan way to advance a communist agenda. So why would they not act that way in this case? If they do want to protect Obama's legacy and the communist policies they've been fighting to protect for decades, there's a very high probability that they will do whatever it takes to survive another 4 years on the court, even if their health and minds are deteriorating. And they are. There is evidence to back up this point. Brief quote from the Daily Signal. A 2010 study on the retirements and deaths of Supreme Court justices concluded that the odds that a justice will retire increased by 168% when the incumbent president is from the same political party as the president who nominated the justice and the presidential administration is in his first or second year. Close quote. So, assuming they acted in their typical partisan fashion, that would mean Trump would only get to replace Scalia, and even then I think it's very unlikely that he replaces him with a conservative for the reasons I've already outlined. In the best case scenario, he replaces the empty seat with a conservative, which would basically put us right back to square one with the evenly divided court we already had. You know, the one that didn't overturn Roe v. Wade, didn't strike down Obamacare, and ruled in favor of imposing illegally and unconstitutionally and despotically same-sex marriage. But more importantly, and more ominously, in the worst-case scenario, Trump cuts a deal with the Democrats, his Democrat allies and friends, getting their support on restricting free trade or immigration. Well, immigration, they want to restrict free trade. In exchange for giving them a moderate justice they would be willing to confirm. Even worse, after a disastrous and embarrassing 4 years as president, again, assuming Trump lasted that long, he would be guaranteed to lose in 2020 in a landslide, much like Jimmy Carter, did in 1980. This would mean that those 3 liberal justices who were waiting to retire when they could be replaced by a Democrat president now could, resulting in 3 new liberal justices on the court until probably the middle of the century. Even if Trump replaced Scalia with a conservative, which he wouldn't, that would tip the balance to the liberals 5-4, and that's being generous because I'm counting Roberts as a conservative here. Now, clearly, this is all based on probabilities. Any one of those justices could die while Trump is president or decide to retire unexpectedly, but it's just as likely neither of those things could happen. Trumplicans have said all along that if Hillary is elected, we know exactly what kind of justices she will appoint to the court, but they've been assuming all along that she'll get the chance to do so. That's an assumption that's based on probabilities, namely the probability of any of the justices dying or retiring while she is president. Either of those things is far from certain, which means it's not the open and shut case they've tried to convince us it is. Now, one could make a case that all outcomes are equally likely. Hillary wins and appoints 1 liberal, 2 liberals, or 3 liberals. Trump wins and appoints 1, 2, or 3 liberals. He's not going to appoint a conservative. Depending on how many justices die or retire during his time in office, and on whether he's willing to fight the Democrats' filibuster if he were actually to appoint a conservative, which he wouldn't. Or Trump wins but loses in 2020, and the new Democrat president appoints 1 liberal, 2 liberals, 3 liberals, 1 little, 2 little, 3 little Indians. 1 little, 2 little, 3 original Americans. Doesn't roll off the tongue, does it? Because none of the justices died or retired until then. As you can see, when you really break down but the Supreme Court argument, it's really kind of flimsy. But beyond that, it's just one factor out of many that we must consider when picking a president of the United States. My own belief is that Trump's severe incompetence, unstable temperament, lack of character and principles, and history of hiring the worst, most incompetent people on the planet, because, see, since Trump is a moron and an ignoramus himself, he's not going to hire people who are better and smarter than he is. He's going to hire people who are even dumber than he is. Think about it. Ego and stupidity are a very, very dangerous combination, folks. But the fact that all these things, severe incompetence, unstable temperament, lack of character and principles, history of hiring the worst, most incompetent people on the planet, completely negate or balance out this Supreme Court argument anyway, even if he was likely to appoint a constitutionalist. Having a semi-conservative Supreme Court will be of little consolation to conservatives when we have a president who claims to represent us, who's tanking the economy, multiplying our debt, because Trump says he won't touch entitlements, and turning off an entire generation of young people to the conservative movement, which will have ripple effects for generations to come. I talked the other day in a video about how there are people who fear that, and George W. Bush has even said this, he fears he will be the last Republican president. He very well may be. But if Trump were to become president, I guarantee you he'd be the last Republican president. There would be no others ever again. Now, I might be accused of exaggerating these potential effects of a Trump presidency, but no, they really are not exaggerations. If anything, they're underestimations. But we're already seeing the effects of Trump's stench on the conservative movement, as many college students who would have eagerly supported a conservative nominee, like Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, Scott Walker, the next generation. Fresh faces, fresh ideas. And instead, well, Trump. Young people or college students millennials are disgusted with Trump and are leaving the party. He's also turning off many young women. I mean, an example of the former is my son. And an example of the latter is my daughter. Turning off many young women to the conservative cause, and they are not likely to return anytime soon. Because even if Trump bows out after this debacle and his post-election insurrection, he's going to start up Trump News Network, right? He's going to keep the Republican Party divided. He's going to continue to dog and keep his stench on the Republican Party for the rest of his life. And remember, people like Donald Trump tend to live to a ripe old age. He'll probably live to be over 100. He'll never go away. I mean, why would they? Why would they return to the GOP when GOP voters nominated a misogynist who was on record talking about assaulting women, and when many Republican men and women are defending him on it? Doug, Jennifer, Alex. Trumplicans' only argument is that all this is worth it just because of a probability, a possibility, a forlorn hope that we'll be able to have a somewhat conservative Supreme Court, even though Republican presidents have a history of nominating liberals, and even though there's an equal probability, a much greater, an actual probability, that those empty seats will be replaced by a liberal president in 2021 and beyond. When it's shown in this light, in the big picture, we can see how it was more of an emotional argument and a political tactic to defend their support of an unelectable and immoral nominee than it was a clearly thought out and rational argument. Trumplicans figured they could use fear to scare us into voting for such a horrible nominee who doesn't even remotely represent our values and principles. They underestimated the strength of our convictions and our knowledge of how our system of checks and balances works. Knowledge that Douglas V. Gibbs, the purported America's constitutional authority, ought to possess in abundance. The Supreme Court isn't the end-all or be-all either. At least it shouldn't be for conservatives. Remember, the Supreme Court is supposed to be the weakest branch of government, not the strongest. But even if it was, the Supreme Court was the be-all and end-all for conservatives, it's foolish and illogical to base one's vote for president entirely on a set of possibilities that have nothing to do with the actual candidate they're voting for. If the Supreme Court was all there was to this election, GOP voters might as well have found the most conservative person in the country, regardless of their profession or past experiences, nominated him or her, and hoped they'd win so that they could act as a rubber stamp for nominating conservative Supreme Court justices. In other words, why didn't you nominate Carly Fiorina? Why didn't you nominate Ben Carson? Both wouldn't know what the bleep they were doing, but I mean, at least they're conservative. Allegedly. Somewhat. It's more than you can say about Trump. I mean, I might as well forget about their experience, temperament, character, competence, which is what many Trumplicans have done by shoving Trump down our throats. I mean, this is no way to pick a nominee or a president. The Supreme Court is only one branch of government, and again, it is supposed to be the weakest one. The president still has great power and influence, particularly on the international stage, and we simply cannot ignore his or her personal attributes and life experiences or lack thereof. History has shown us that they're crucial and determine far more than who they end up nominating to the Supreme Court. In the end, the Supreme Court argument that many conservatives used to justify supporting Trump, including Ted Cruz, was the last branch they had to stand on. But like all of the other branches, it was weak, it was flaccid, it was spaghetti-esque, and not nearly enough of a reason by itself for conservatives to hold their nose, commit ideological suicide, and vote for the worst nominee in the history of the Republican Party. I would instead urge conservatives to come on home and vote for the only candidate in the race who is a principled conservative with character and wisdom. His name is Evan McMullin. You won't regret it.